Let the room around you grow softer than parchment, and let your breath fall in time with the slow turning of a key that was forged before the foundations of the sea. You are not where you think you are. You are crouched in this dim and patient hour on a dry shelf of black stone above a shaft that should not exist. There is no village near you, no road, no kindled hearth. There is only a circle of cracked basalt under your hand, and a seal upon that circle that is held since before the first city raised its first wall. The seal is not made of metal, and not made of stone, and not made of any material your tongue has a name for. It is made of obedience. And tonight, in this slow story, I will pour into your ear like dark wine. That obedience is finally about to give way. Listen carefully now, because the text we are reading together is the 9th chapter of a book that the early world fought over for 2 centuries before deciding, with great reluctance, to keep it. Within its lines, a star falls from the upper sky. It does not strike the earth as a flame. It descends, instead, as a figure given a key. And that key fits the throat of the pit, and the pit, for a length of time no calendar can measure, has been waiting. Before we go further, set this carefully in your mind. The word at the heart of this account is older than the book that made it famous. In the Hebrew of an earlier age, the syllables were spoken as Abaddon, drawn from a verb that means simply to perish, to vanish, to be undone. For most of its slow life inside the older scriptures, Abaddon was not a being at all. It was a place. It was the bare floor under the floor of the grave. It was the depth beneath Sheol, paired with death the way 2 unlit lamps are paired upon a forgotten shelf. In the book of Job, the writer speaks of it as a hollow exposed before the eyes of the Most High, with no covering and no shadow to hide it. In Proverbs, it lies open beside the underworld itself, watched constantly, never sleeping. In one slow line of Job, almost overlooked by all who pass through that book, Abaddon and death are said to have heard, with ears, a rumor of hidden wisdom. That single sentence is the first crack in the floor. That single sentence is where the place begins, very gently, to grow a face. You should let that detail rest on you for a long moment, because most of the tradition you have been taught skips over it. Most retellings begin with the locusts. Most retellings begin with the smoke and the iron noise. But the slow scholars who first wrestled with this material understood that the deeper unease lies in the quiet earlier centuries, in the long span when Abaddon was nothing more than a region, a sealed cellar of the cosmos, a hush at the bottom of the world. The fear, you see, is not that a monster came into being. The fear is that a country acquired a king. By the time the writer of Revelation walks into the room of history with his lampstands and his trumpets, that older silence has matured into something with a will. The pit is no longer simply geography. It has acquired a sovereign. The text names him in 2 languages, as though to be sure no listener escapes the recognition. In Hebrew, Abaddon. In Greek, Apollyon, the active, present tense, hungry word that means the one who destroys. The transition is so quiet that most readers miss it, yet it is one of the most curious migrations in all of biblical thought. A condition becomes an officer. A depth becomes an authority. A noun becomes a throne. Lower the lantern of your attention now, and let it drift down through layers of stone older than every empire whose name you have ever spoken. The shaft of which this book speaks does not have a measurable bottom. The Greek word it uses is abusos, and abusos is not a hole the way a well is a hole. It is the absence of a floor. It is the place where measurement gives up. To stand at its rim, even in a vision, is to feel the ordinary weight of one's body, forget how to belong to the ground. And here is the slow truth, told to you tonight in the calm voice of someone who has read these pages too many times to be afraid of them. The world you have walked across all your life, the world of bread and lamps and small kindly streets, has, according to these texts, always rested upon a sealed basement. Not a metaphor, a basement, with a door, and a key, and a keeper. You may have lived your whole life never wondering what hangs underneath your house, never wondering what lies underneath the soil under your house, never wondering what lies underneath that soil at the deepest place no shovel will ever reach. The keepers of these old scrolls did wonder. They wondered with such patience that they wrote books about it, and other books to argue with those books, and then locked many of those books away. The basement is patient. The basement is older than any record. The basement has been waiting, in its slow, patient way, since before the first vowel was spoken aloud. Hold that picture in your hand, like an object made of cool, dim glass. We are going to carry it together, gently, into the next part of this telling, where the seal grows thinner and the quiet beneath your feet begins, with the smallest possible sound to answer. The seal grows thinner. The seal grows thinner because, long before the writer of Revelation, other patient hands were already lifting the corner of it. Travel with me now, away from the shaft, away from the basalt rim, into a different kind of dim. We are crossing into a small cave mouth set into a cliff above the salt-heavy water of the Dead Sea, somewhere along the eastern edge of the wilderness of Judea, in a century before the Common Era began to count its years. The cave is dry. The air inside it tastes of mineral dust and old linen. There are clay jars set against the cave wall, sealed with bitumen, and inside those jars are scrolls. The scrolls are written in cramped Hebrew and Aramaic, on leather thinned and scraped until it gleams like the inside of a moth's wing. The light here comes from a single oil lamp resting in a niche carved into the limestone. And the flame is so small that it bends every time someone breathes near it. Outside the cave, the wadi is empty. The stars over the desert are colorless and slow, and the men who hide these jars are about to disappear from history, leaving only their writing behind. Set down the weight of the modern hour, and follow the smell of cold furnace ash drifting up from a shaft that was sealed long before language. We have come here because the people of these caves were the first ones in this slow lineage to understand that Abaddon was not, after all, a passive thing. They were called by some names you have heard, and some names you have not. The careful scholars of our age know them as the Yahad, or the Essenes, or simply the community of Qumran. Whatever they called themselves, they wrote in the clean evening hours of long centuries of a war that had already begun in the upper air and was leaking very slowly into the lower one. Their worldview was dual and as severe as cut stone. Two great parties, they said, were drawn up against each other, not in the marketplaces of Judea, but in the deeper architecture of creation. There were the sons of light, allotted to the Prince of Lights, and there were the sons of darkness, allotted to a figure they named Belial. Belial. Hold that name carefully, because it has a weight. In the older Hebrew, Belial is a word that suggests worthlessness, ruin, a thing that yields no fruit, a swallowing. In the writings of these cave keepers, he is no longer merely a word. He is a prince, A host marches with him, and that host belongs, in one breath, to the pit and to the night. Now reach with me into one of the longest of their hymns, the collection scholars call the Hodayot, or the Thanksgiving hymns. There, in a column numbered by modern hands as 11, the writer praises the Most High for having raised him out of the underworld, lifting him, in his own quiet phrasing, from the Sheol of Abaddon to an everlasting height. Notice what he has just done. He has not said Sheol alone, and he has not said Abaddon alone. He has fused them. The grave, which was once a single place, has become a place inside a place, an inner cellar within the cellar, a vault sunk beneath the vault. And then only a few breaths later in the same hymn, the writer leans closer to the parchment and inscribes a sentence so cinematic that it has been carried into nearly every modern study of the abyss. He writes that the torrents of Belial break into Abaddon. Read it again in the slow voice of memory. The torrents of Belial break into Abaddon. The picture is of dark water, hot and fast, rupturing the lower wall of the pit and pouring downward into a still lower hollow, a hollow that no map has ever known. Up until that line, you might have imagined Abaddon as a single room. After that line, you understand. There are doors below the doors. There are pits beneath the pit. The deep has its own deep. In another fragment from the same library, numbered 4Q432 by the patient catalogers of our own century, the writer says something stranger still. He says that Sheol and Abaddon crack open, and that all the arrows of the pit make their voice heard. Not visible, heard. The arrows have voices. The arrows speak. And what they speak is a single sound that has no human meaning, only intention. Hold the picture for a long, slow moment. The crack opens. A low chord rises from below, the chord of every weapon ever held in reserve down there. It is the first true sound in this story, the first noise after centuries of silence. And it is not a roar, and it is not a howl. It is, somehow, more grave than either. It is the released voice of armaments that have been waiting, dressed and oiled, in the dark. Let me give you the deeper meaning of these scrolls, gently, before we leave the cave. They tell you, in their slow ritual way, that the underworld is not idle. It is not a closed room of dust. It is a containment. It is a pressurized vessel. It is a cellar full of standing weapons, breath held against the seal, and what we, in our daylight world, call peace, is only the long, quiet hum of that pressure not yet permitted to escape. The dim flame in the niche bends once more. Outside, somewhere along the cliff, a fox steps on a stone and listens. The men who wrote these scrolls will be gone soon. The Romans will arrive within a generation, and the caves will be sealed with their jars inside them. And a long, dry sleep will fall over the parchment for nearly 2,000 years. But the words they wrote in this last calm century will keep their patient grammar. The pit, they wrote, has an inner pit. The deep, they wrote, has an inner deep. The dark, they wrote, has an inner dark. And every one of those inner places, dear listener, has a door. And every one of those doors, in its slow, patient way, has been listening for the sound of a key. So we leave the cave and we leave the lamp, and the dust of Qumran falls quietly behind us as the centuries unwind. The next door we open does not stand in a cliff of stone. It stands in the open height of the sky. Let your shoulders sink toward the dark mineral hush, and let the sound of your own pulse become a small, slow trumpet at the edge of a sleeping pit. We are walking now in the company of a man who is not, strictly speaking, dead. His name in the older books is Enoch. He is a patriarch of the 7th generation from the first man, and the calm Hebrew genealogies, in the brief few lines they give him, say of him only this, that he walked with God and was not, for God took him. He was not buried. He was not mourned. He was simply lifted, in some manner the texts decline to explain, out of his own century and into a vast, dim travel through the architecture of creation. The book that bears his name is older than Revelation by perhaps 300 years, perhaps more. It was loved by the early Christian world, then quietly excluded from most of its later canons, then forgotten almost everywhere except a single highland kingdom in Ethiopia, which kept the manuscript on its monastery shelves while the rest of the literate world allowed it to drift into a long, dry dark. Enoch, we are told, is taken into the upper places by the great angelic guides, by Uriel, by Raphael, by Michael, and by other names that the centuries have softened. He is shown the storehouses of snow and the storehouses of wind. He is shown the chambers where the souls of the dead are kept in compartments, sorted by kind, awaiting a verdict that has not yet been spoken aloud. And then, at a point in the journey, his text marks with the simplest and most quiet understatement. He is taken to the edge of a pit. You should understand, before we look down with him, what kind of pit this is. It is not a hole in the earth, as you have thought of holes. The book describes it as a place beyond the great earth, beyond the limit of soil and sea. It has no sky above it. It has no foundation below it. There is no water in it, the text says, and no land. There is, instead, a slow vertical absence, lit only by what the writer calls pillars of heavenly fire, columns of flame falling into the void in a manner that has no top and no bottom that any measurement can find. Stand at the rim of that picture for a long, quiet moment, dear listener, and let the impossibility of it lower you, gently, into your own breath. There are columns of flame. They are falling. They never land. Uriel, the angel walking beside Enoch, names the place. He says it is the prison of the rebellious. He says it is the holding cell for the stars who broke their courses, for the angels who came down out of heaven and took for themselves the daughters of men. The book gives those angels a particular name, and it is one of those words that has stayed alive in the shadows of religion for 4,000 years. They are called the Watchers. The Watchers were a high order of beings, set in the older grammar of the cosmos, to guard, to watch, to stand patient on the wall of the world and observe. But they did not stand. They descended, and in descending, they taught humanity arts that the earlier order had not intended for it to know. They taught the cutting of metal into weapons. They taught the mixing of pigments and the painting of eyes. They taught the speaking of names that should not be spoken aloud, and the calling of powers that should not have been called. They took wives among mortal women, and from those unions came hybrid children, whose own children, in the older accounts, became the giants who briefly walked the earth before the great water came down to wash them away. Now look again into the pit. Look slowly. Because the angels in the columns of falling fire are not symbolic. The book insists they are real. They are bound there. They are bound by chains the text describes as having no metal, only command. They are awaiting, in a stasis that has lasted, by the time you and I are speaking, more than 100 mortal generations, the day of their final reckoning. They have not slept in that time. They have not aged. They have not, in any sense the human nervous system can map, suffered the passing of the centuries the way you and I have suffered them. They have only waited. This is the cellar that Revelation, 3 centuries later, will quietly inherit. The locust host that climbs out of the smoke in the 9th chapter of John's vision is not a new species of nightmare invented by a single Greek-trained Jewish prophet on a rocky island. It is the long-descended progeny of the Watcher's offspring, retained in the lower architecture of creation until the appointed key turns. Sit with that slowly, because most popular tellings of the book of Revelation skip past it. The dread that climbs into our world in the 5th trumpet has been kept in storage since long before the city of Ur was raised, since long before the first sail was set on the first water, since long before any voice you have ever loved spoke its first word. That is the deeper meaning, told plainly, of what was kept in those Ethiopian highland libraries, while the rest of the literate world looked elsewhere. The cosmos, in the eyes of these older writers, is not a single open room. It is a stack. It is a stack of chambers. The upper chambers hold the storehouses of weather and the slow circling of the lights. The middle chamber holds the green earth and the small, bright waking we call our life. And the lower chambers hold the prison of the prison, and the prison's prison. Lower the lantern of your attention one more careful degree. We have not yet reached the bottom. We will leave the prison of the watchers behind us now, but only as far as the next door, because the next door is buried in sand. We are crossing, in the long tide of the centuries, into the dry uplands of Upper Egypt, into the year 1945 of the Common Counting, into the first soft hours after a brother and a brother and a brother of a small farming family have stopped their donkeys at the foot of a red cliff called Jabal al-Tarif. They are looking, on this particular morning, for soft mineral fertilizer to spread on their fields. Instead, beneath the red dust, their hoe strikes the lid of a sealed jar. What is inside that jar is not fertilizer. What is inside that jar are 13 leather-bound codices, 12 books, and the loose pages of a 13th, written in Coptic, copied perhaps in the late 4th century by monks of a monastery further down the Nile, then carried out into the desert and buried, with great care, before the orthodoxy of that age could find and burn them. Inside those codices lies a literature scholars now call the Nag Hammadi Library. The men who wrote them did not consider themselves heretics. They considered themselves possessors of a knowledge the official churches had begun to forbid. The word they used for that knowledge was gnosis. They thought that gnosis was the only thing that would set them free. And in the codices they buried that morning, they wrote, with a strange and beautiful pessimism, of how the world we walk in came to be. Set down the weight of the modern hour once more, and follow me into the slow grammar of one of those buried books called On the Origin of the World. It begins with a thought you have probably never been told in any chapel of your childhood. It says, very gently, that chaos is not original. It says that what we call the deep, the disordered water, the formless dark beneath all things, was not present at the very first instant of creation. It came later. It came as a shadow. Let me explain. Slowly. In the older Orthodox account, the deep is a given. It simply is. It precedes the Spirit moving over the face of the waters. But the Gnostics who buried these scrolls beneath the cliff said, no, look more carefully. Before the deep, there was pistis, sometimes called faith and sometimes called wisdom. a high feminine principle, present in the upper light of the unknowable Father. And out of her, in some manner the book struggled to articulate, fell a shadow. The shadow widened. It became a vast, cold ocean of unfathomable depth. That ocean was not formed. That ocean was secreted. That ocean was the first leak in the wall of the unknowable. And then, out of that secreted ocean, something climbed. He was a being with the face of a lion and the body of a serpent, the books say, an androgynous power born of disorder rather than light. The Gnostics gave him many names, and one of those names is Yaldabaoth. In some texts, he is also called Samael, which means, in older Hebrew, the blind one. He climbed up out of the unbidden waters and proclaimed himself the only God. He did not know about the upper light from which his mother had fallen. He thought he was the first thing. He set up his court in his ignorance, and he made a hierarchy of lesser archons under him, and he built, out of the matter of his mother's shadow, the lower heavens we now mistake for the entire sky. What this means, dear listener, is that the world we live in the slow, strange logic of these Egyptian desert books, is not the original work of the highest light. It is a basement built by a blind landlord, and the abyss into which revelation will later fling open a shaft is not a foreign country to the world above it. It is the same substance as the world above it. It is the older basement of the basement. The unspoken first ocean from which the lion-faced builder climbed in his slow embarrassment of self-deception. You may begin to understand now why this version of things made the bishops of the larger official churches uneasy. If chaos was a leak rather than a given, then the cosmos was a mistake before it was a glory. If the maker of the lower heavens was blind, then the daily authorities of religion who claimed his name might also, by inheritance, be blind. And if salvation came not only through sacrifice, but through knowledge, through the slow, inner unsealing of the higher light remembered, then the priestly hierarchy that handled bread and wine and confession was not the gate it claimed to be. It was a curtain. The Gnostics did not want to overthrow the curtain. They wanted to lift its corner, alone, in the dark, and look at what lay behind it. The Orthodox response was patient and severe. In the year 367, a bishop in Alexandria named Athanasius wrote a long Easter letter that, among many other things, set out a list of the books to be considered scripture. The list was short. Many older books were left off it. 3 years later, at the Council of Laodicea, the gathered bishops formally forbade the reading of non-canonical writings in church gatherings. The texts that did not make the list did not vanish in a single fire. They drifted into private libraries, and then into monastery cellars, and then into the margins of forgotten letters, and then into a long civil silence. But forgetfulness is not the same as destruction. In the long brown sand above the Nile, those Coptic monks, knowing that an order had come down to surrender all such books for inspection, chose another path. They sealed their codices into a jar. They carried the jar into the cliff. They covered the jar with red earth, and they walked away, leaving behind, for 16 quiet centuries, an unedited memory of the abyss as a leaked first ocean, ruled by a blind builder, beneath a sky that was never the original sky. That, slow and careful listener, is the second cellar beneath the cellar. The first cellar was the prison of the watchers. The second cellar is the disowned ocean from which the lower heavens themselves were drawn. And we are still descending. We have not yet reached the bottom. Now we must climb back upward briefly, only to descend again, because the cellars we have just walked through were not the only cellars the older world built. the fear of an underground host, of a numbered, contained swarm of destroyers waiting upon a divine word, did not begin on Patmos, and did not begin in Qumran, and did not begin in Egypt. It is older than any of them. It is older than the Hebrew language itself. To find the next chamber of this story, we must travel east, across the salt and the sand, into the long, flat country between two great rivers. We are walking, in this slow movement of the imagination, into ancient Mesopotamia. The light here is a low, dust-reddened gold, the gold of late afternoons, in a place where the sun has been burning the bricks of the cities for thousands of years before you were born. The streets are made of mud brick. The temples are stepped pyramids of mud brick, called ziggurats, set in the centers of walled cities whose names you may have heard once in school and forgotten. Akkad, Babylon, Uruk, Nineveh. The priests here read the future in the slow stir of oil dropped into water, and in the patterns of dust gathered over a sacrificial liver. And in the dim back rooms of the libraries, a clay tablet, written in a wedge-shaped script no human alive in your century learned in childhood, tells a story that will, in its own slow way, mirror Revelation 800 years before Revelation is written. Lower the lantern of your attention again, gently, onto that clay. The story is called The Epic of Era and Isham. Era is a god. He is not a friendly god. He is the god of inflicted death, of war, of plague, of the slow burning of fields. He is, in many of the old tablets, blended together with another older figure named Nergal, who is the lord of the Mesopotamian underworld, the place these tablets call Ker. Era reigns over a country of dust and mineral hush beneath the streets of the cities, and in the epic, he becomes irritated. Note that detail. He is not enraged. He is not stricken with vengeance. He is, in the calm, almost domestic phrasing of the tablet, irritated. He has come to feel, in the slow grinding of his immortal patience, that humanity has grown disrespectful, that the cities have grown loud, that the offerings have grown thin. He decides that the noise must stop. And in deciding this, he reaches into his armory and draws out his living weapons. Hold this carefully, because it is one of the most overlooked rhymes in the entire ancestry of the abyss. Era does not march into the cities himself. He sends ahead of him a vanguard of 7 beings. They are called the Sabiti. The High Sky Father Anu made these 7 and gave them as a gift to Era. They are not symbolic. The tablets describe each of the 7 in deliberate detail. One is given the brilliance of fire. One is given the fearful aspect of a lion. One is given the appearance of a tempest. Each of the 7 was made for a single purpose, which is to fall upon the cities of men and to break them. They wait in the underworld of Kur for Era's command. They are not free. They are not autonomous. They are kept in stasis, kept in a country beneath the country, kept under the strict authority of a higher god whose patience is the only door between them and the daylight world above. Sit with that picture for a long, quiet moment, dear listener, while the dust of Mesopotamia settles on your palms. 800 years before John of Patmos sees a star fall from heaven and a key turn in the throat of an abyssal pit, the Babylonians were already telling a story in which a numbered host of underworld destroyers was kept in stasis, kept in a country beneath the country, kept under the strict authority of a higher god, and released only when the patience of that God finally ran out. The Bible did not invent the architecture of the contained swarm. The Bible inherited it. It inherited it from a world that had been, for 1,000 years already, painting this same picture on temple walls and pressing it into clay. Walk west with me now, only a little, across the long brown river country and into the older shore of Canaan, where another god of older terror stood. He was named Resheph. He was the lord of plague, and he was older even than the histories that wrote him down, older than the city of Ebla, where his name was already being carved in the 3rd millennium before the Common Counting. The temples of Canaan called him the Lord of Arrows. The peoples of his time understood, in their slow pre-medical way, that disease did not always crawl. Sometimes disease arrived without warning, in a single hour, in a single afternoon, a man hale at noon and burning with fever by evening. And in the imagination of those older centuries, that kind of arrival was not a microbe. It was a thrown thing. It was an arrow shot invisibly from the bow of a god. Resheph carried the bow of plague. He stood at the gate of the underworld and let his arrows fall where his hand directed them. And though the Hebrew Bible later refuses to name him as a separate god, it does not, in its honesty, erase him. In the 3rd chapter of the prophet Habakkuk, when the writer pictures the Most High coming forward in judgment, he says that pestilence walks before him and plague follows close at his heels. The Hebrew word for plague there, in the older grain of the language, is Resheph. The Lord of Arrows has been demoted. He has been folded down. He is now an attendant rather than a peer. But he is still walking with the army, still drawing his bow, still loosing his arrows into the small, breakable lungs of those whose seal has been removed. Now lay these two pictures, Era and Resheph, gently next to the picture we already carry of the locust host of the abyss. They overlap. They overlap in a way that no later editor could quite scrub out. A higher authority, a contained host below, a release of plague, a strict permission to harm, an army of weapons that are not metal but living, hungry, and patient. The 5th trumpet of John's vision did not fall, like a stone, from a clean, unrelated sky. It rose, in the long vapor of cultural memory, out of every cellar the old Near Eastern world had already imagined. We have not yet reached the bottom, but we are very close now to the moment when the door begins to lift on its hinges. We are still in the long Mediterranean dim, where the older world hung its myths between coast and coast. We must turn our attention now to one more god before the door beneath our feet begins to lift. And this one stands in a place you would not, at first, expect to find him. He stands in the bright, high sun. He is the god of music, of healing, of prophecy. He is the most luminous of the Olympian beings. He is the chosen patron of poets, of physicians, of the patient, careful art of the lyre. His temples were built of the whitest stone the older quarries could find, and the priests inside those temples sang in measured rhythms to greet his bright morning chariot. His name, of course, is Apollo. And it is in his name, dear listener, that the writer of Revelation hides one of the most calmly devastating linguistic acts in the entire book. Lower yourself again into the steady hush, and let me show you the small grammatical detail that hangs the political weight of the entire 9th chapter. The text names the king of the abyss in 2 languages. In Hebrew, he is Abaddon. In Greek, the writer says, he is called Apollyon. Apollyon. It is a Greek word built on the verb apolumi, which means to destroy, to ruin utterly, to undo. It is a real word, used in older Greek literature to describe acts of total devastation. But you will notice, if you say it slowly, the way it sits inside its own sounds. Apollyon, Apollo. The two names share 4 of their 5 syllables. They share the same opening, the same vowel, the same root rhythm in the mouth. The writer of Revelation is not making an accident. The writer is making, in the most quiet and most surgical way, a pun. But it is no ordinary pun. To understand its weight, you must remember that Apollo, in the older world, was not only the bright god of the lyre. He was also, in his older and crueler aspect, a god of plague. In the very first book of the Iliad, when the priest Chryses calls upon his patron deity to punish the Greek army for the offense done to him, Apollo descends from the heights of Olympus. The poet describes him with arrows on his back, and the arrows rattle as he walks, and as he comes down the mountain he is described as moving like the night. He stops at the edge of the Greek camp. He raises his silver bow, and for 9 days his arrows fall upon the Greek army, killing first the mules and the dogs, and then the men. The army does not see him. They see only the corpses multiplying. The plague in that older grammar is not a microbe carried by a flea. It is a deliberate instrument, drawn from a god's quiver, loosed from a god's bow, falling, hour upon hour, into the camps of those who have not yet noticed they are already condemned. There was, in the older Greek world, a particular cult name attached to this aspect of Apollo. He was called, in some shrines, Apollo Parnopion. The word in Greek means, with chilling simplicity, the locust god. As Parnopion, Apollo had the sovereign right to summon swarms of locusts to consume the fields of his enemies, or to drive those swarms away from the fields of his friends. He was the patron, in other words, of the very phenomenon Revelation now imagines climbing out of the pit. And so, when the writer of Revelation gives the king of the abyss the name Apollyon, he is not simply calling him the destroyer. He is reaching across the linguistic floor of the Greek world and selecting, with great care, the one prestige god of the Roman pantheon, whose hidden underside best matches the figure rising through the smoke. Now consider, for a slow, patient moment, why this would have made certain readers in the first century go very still. The Roman emperors had taken to identifying themselves, in coinage, in statuary, in temple worship, with Apollo. Caligula made the comparison openly. Nero performed in Apollo's costume on stages built for the purpose. Domitian, who was emperor while many scholars believe Revelation was being composed, accepted the title Lord and God, and wore the laurel wreath of Apollo's iconography. The cult of the emperor and the cult of Apollo had quietly braided themselves together. And so, when the writer of the Apocalypse assigns the name Apollyon to a being climbing out of a furnace shaft beneath the world, he is, in the most dangerous and elegant way available to him, telling his persecuted readers that the prestige of Rome and the prestige of the bright god of the lyre share, beneath their gold, a common root with the destroyer of the pit. This is one of the reasons the book was kept under quiet review by the early authorities. It is also one of the reasons that, even today, certain currents of scholarship treat the 9th chapter of Revelation with a careful distance, because to read it cleanly is to feel the cold political point underneath its monstrous imagery. The Locust King is not a foreign demon. The Locust King is, in part, a parody of the regime under whose lamp the writer was working. Before we leave the comparative chamber, dear listener, let me set one more older shape beside the others. We must look briefly into the funerary art of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians imagined the underworld as a series of gates, each guarded by a hybrid being. Among those guardians sat a creature called Ammit, who waited at the foot of the great scale where each soul was weighed against a feather. If the heart was heavier than the feather, the soul was given to her, and she ate it. Ammit had the head of a crocodile, the front of a lion, and the rear of a hippopotamus. She was a single body assembled from 3 of the most feared killers of the Nile Valley. The terror of her was not in any one of her parts. The terror of her was in the way the parts had been welded together, against natural law, into a single, deliberate punishment creature. That, listener, is the older grammar Revelation now leans into. The locust host that climbs out of the pit is not a single animal. It is a collapse of categories. It is a stack of mismatched predators welded into a single judgment engine. And the welding, as we are about to see, is about to be revealed. Lower the lantern 1 final degree. The door beneath us, after so many centuries, is beginning to move. The 5th trumpet sounds. Hold there for a moment. Hold there, listener, before we follow the sound. Picture the small, careful instrument from which it is loosed. In John's vision, the trumpets are held by 7 angelic beings standing before the Most High, and each trumpet is a slim, curved horn of bronze, and each blast is not an instrument as you have ever heard one. It is a long, deliberate vibration that sets the air of the upper sky and the air of the lower sky into the same trembling at the same instant. The sound is not loud the way a cannon is loud. It is total. It moves through the columns of air the way an earthquake moves through stone, finding the seams in things, finding the weakness in things, finding the place where the world has been holding itself shut. And it finds the seal. Now look up, briefly, with the eye of the vision. There is a star descending. The text describes it as a star fallen from heaven, and you must not picture this as a comet. It is not light streaking. It is a slow, controlled descent of a being whose form is bright, whose face is composed, whose hand carries a single object. The object is a key. The key is plain. The key is the kind of key you might have seen turned in the lock of an old wooden door in a village your grandmother's grandmother once knew. It is small. It is utterly out of proportion with the size of what it opens, and that, in itself, is the first hush of the horror. Because it tells you that the lock beneath your feet has always been simple. It has only ever required the right hand. The right hand has now, in this single instant of the vision, arrived. The key turns. The key turns, and the seal, which is held since before the foundations of the older sea, parts. There is no shattering. There is no breaking. The text is careful here. The shaft simply opens. And at first, in the long-held breath that follows, nothing comes out of it. Nothing. There is only a low pressure change in the air around the rim, a slight pull, as though the world above were exhaling, very gently, into the world below. And then the smoke begins. You should let me describe this smoke slowly, because the writer of Revelation describes it with a single brief simile. And that simile contains, beneath its calm surface, every chimney of every Bronze Age forge that the older world ever knew. The text says, "The smoke rises like the smoke of a great furnace." Picture then an industrial column. Picture a Bronze Age smithy at the height of its labor, the kind in which iron is being beaten into weapons day and night, the kind in which the air is so thick that the men working inside it are visible only as silhouettes against the orange. Now multiply that smoke by an order of magnitude no human chimney has ever produced. The shaft now releases that volume of smoke per second, per breath. The column rises black and dense and oily, climbing past the height where birds fly, past the height where storms gather, past the height where the air itself grows thin. It is not a cloud. It is a wall of soot, rising vertically out of the ground. And then the smoke spreads. It spreads outward from the shaft in every direction, and as it spreads, the light of the sun begins to be eaten. The text is precise. The sun and the air, the writer says, are darkened by the smoke. Notice that doubling, not only the sun, but the air itself. The air becomes a medium of darkness. The temperature drops. The bright color of midday flattens into a sickly copper haze. The shadows on the ground grow long, then so long they merge into a single twilight that is not evening, because evening softens, but this does not soften. This presses, this thickens, this lays the weight of furnace air across every roof and every field and every uplifted face. There is the smell of sulfur, the smell of burning bronze, the smell of something organic and impossibly old being released after centuries of compression. The world goes still. The world goes very still. And then the world begins to hear. The first sound is not from the shaft. The first sound is from the air itself. A drone begins, low and metallic, a vibration like the sound of many distant chariots running across a plain of iron. And the listeners on the rooftops cannot at first locate the direction it is coming from, because it is coming, in fact, from above and from below at once. The drone is the sound of wings, layered wings. Tens of thousands of armored wings rising in formation through the column of smoke. And then, slowly, like ash settling onto the surface of a still pond, the first of them descends out of the cloud into the dim copper light, and you see what has been kept beneath the world. Take this slowly. Take it slowly, because every detail is deliberate. The body is the size of a war horse, muscular, prepared for battle, and you understand at once that these are not insects in the sense your eye knows insects. They are larger than the largest carriage. Upon their heads sit crowns the color of dulled gold, the gold of relics buried with kings, the gold of objects that have not been polished in 1,000 years, and yet retain beneath their tarnish a faint and sickly shine. Beneath those crowns, the faces are not insectile. The faces are human. Human in the way a face seen across a candle in a lonely room is human, with eyes that look back at you, with expressions that read you, with a quiet, sentient malice that no ordinary animal could carry. Long hair flows from beneath the crowns, hair like the hair of women, blown sideways in the rising heat of the shaft. The mouths open. The teeth are the teeth of lions, set in human faces, and the mouths smile. Their thoraxes are armored in iron breastplates, dull gray, riveted in seams. Their abdomens taper to long, curved tails, and at the tip of each tail sits the curved sting of a scorpion, ready, glistening with a substance the text declines to name. And they fly. They fly out across the sky in their tens of thousands, with the metallic chariot roar of their wings filling every street of every city of the world. The door has lifted, the cellar has emptied, and the pain, dear listener, is about to begin. The pain begins. Note carefully, before we describe it, the rules under which it begins. The locusts do not, in this vision, fall upon every living thing. The text is meticulous. They are forbidden, with clear divine instruction, to harm the grass of the earth. They are forbidden to harm the green plants. They are forbidden to harm any tree. This is the most quietly upending detail in the entire 9th chapter. Because in every previous account of locusts that the older world had ever told, the entire purpose of locusts was to consume green things. They lived for that. They were known for that. They were the swarms that arrived at harvest and left only stubble behind them. But these are not those locusts. These are something wearing the shape of locusts, and the green world to them is not food. What is food, in their case, is human pain. The text says they are given 5 months in which to torment those who do not bear the seal of God upon their foreheads. 5 months. Pause there for a careful moment, listener, because the number is not arbitrary. 5 months is the lifespan of an ordinary locust swarm. It is the duration of a natural plague, from the first lifting of the ground to the last fall of the last exhausted insect. The writer of Revelation has assigned to his supernatural host the calendar of a natural one. And in doing so, he has done something stranger than the picture itself. He has imposed upon the seller of the world the same patient time that ordinary biology already moves in. The torment is not endless. The torment is metered. The torment is, in the cold paperwork of the heavens, exactly 5 months long. During those 5 months, the text says, the sting of the scorpion will fall upon the unsealed. The pain is described as the pain of the scorpion sting, and you should understand what that meant in the older Mediterranean grammar. A scorpion's sting was not a swift killing instrument. A scorpion's sting was known, in the older medical writings, for inducing days of agony, of localized burning, of muscular spasm, of fever, of a peculiar inability to find rest. Multiply that by the supernatural register Revelation is operating in. The locusts are not delivering a single dose. They are a moving cloud of stings, falling upon the same body again and again, in a continual pulsing assault that does not stop at any sundown. And here is the line on which the philosophy of the chapter pivots. The writer says that during those days, men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death, the text says, will flee from them. Sit with that long enough to feel it. Sit with it the way you would sit with a piece of news from a person you love. In the older grammar of human experience, death has always been the last available door. When the pain became too great, when the betrayal became too wide, when the body could no longer hold what was being asked of it, death was the floor that finally caught the falling. The writer of Revelation, in 3 carefully placed clauses, takes that floor away. Not for everyone, not forever, but for the unsealed. For 5 months, in the season of the trumpet, the floor is sealed in the same way the shaft was once sealed. The body is now a closed structure. The pain has nowhere to drain. And the deepest mercy a body has ever known, the kind ending of itself, is, by command from above, withheld. You should understand, listener, that this is the reason the chapter has been read for 2,000 years with a kind of careful awe. It is not the imagery of the monsters. It is the architecture of the permission. Notice what the text reveals, very gently, as the swarm rises. The locusts have a king. They have been given 5 months. They have been told what they may eat and what they may not. They have been told whom they may strike and whom they may not. They are, in the most precise sense, not autonomous. The cellar has not erupted. The cellar has been opened. There is a difference between an eruption and an opening, and the difference is the will above. This is the final, slow, philosophical hush at the heart of the chapter. The abyss is not free. The abyss has never been free. It has, since the first sealing, been a contracted instrument. The destroyer has a name and an office. The host has a calendar and a code of engagement. The pain is metered, the targets are listed, the duration is fixed. The cosmos, in this older and quieter vision, is morally structured all the way down. And the moral structure includes a basement in which official agents of devastation are kept in stasis until permitted release. Some readers find that comforting. Some readers find it more frightening than chaos. Both responses are honest, and the writer of Revelation, I suspect, expected both. To know that nothing is loose in the dark may, in some hours, be the gentlest news the cosmos can give. To know that the dark itself is a managed instrument, and that the management above the dark is willing, in some hours of history, to release what has been managed, may be the heavier news. There is one further inflection to draw out before we close this chamber and move toward the slower, last rooms of the telling. In the very first verses of Genesis, the world is described as moving from formlessness to form. The Hebrew phrase for that older formlessness is tohu wabohu, a phrase that carries, in its own mouth, the sound of an emptiness exhaling. God speaks, and the formlessness recedes, and the green world rises into shape. The fifth trumpet of Revelation, in its own slow image grammar, is a brief and surgical reversal of that moment. The seal is loosened. The smoke darkens the sun, undoing the first day. The chimeric host emerges, undoing the day on which the animals were assigned their kinds. The scaffolding of creation is briefly unbuilt, and the older formlessness is allowed to press, in 5-month measure, against the window pane of the world. And then, the writer assures us, the 5 months end. The seal returns. The shaft is, once again, what it was. But the listener who has read this chapter slowly, even once, will not entirely forget what was on the other side of that pane. Lower the lantern one more careful turn. There is, beneath even this, a final corridor. There is, beneath the 9th chapter, a quieter set of corridors that most readers never walk. They open off the main hall, and they lead into older or stranger texts, into translations almost no one notices, and into the long modern afterlife of the chapter itself. We will walk through 3 of them, slowly, before we sit down by the dying embers and let the night settle over us. The first corridor leads to a manuscript so obscure that for most of its life it has been known only by a catalog number, kept in a small church in the valley of Jehoshaphat near Jerusalem. It is written in Coptic, dates from the 10th century, and is called The Investiture of Abaddon. It tells a counter-story about the figure we have been following all night, a story almost no one has heard. In this version, Abaddon is not a fallen rebel. He is, in the most uncomfortable possible inversion, a creature of the upper light, a high obedient angel who once carried a different name. When the Most High decided to fashion the first man, he needed clay from the earth, and he sent 7 angels, one by one, to gather it. But the earth, in this strange, older imagination, was sentient. The earth could see forward. The earth knew what humanity was destined to become. The cities it would burn, the brothers it would betray, the wars it would carry forward through every generation. And the earth cried out and refused to be taken. 6 of the angels, hearing the earth's pleading, returned empty-handed. The 7th angel was named Muriel. He was a quiet figure, not famous in the older lists. But Muriel did not flinch. He listened to the earth's cry, considered it, and then, with a calm, steady obedience that no one in the heavens had matched before him, he reached down and extracted the clay anyway. As his reward, the Most High elevated him, changed his name, and seated him upon a molten throne in the lower architecture of creation. From that day forward, Muriel was no longer Muriel. He was called Abaddon, and the souls of every human being who would ever be drawn from that clay would in the end pass under his hand. In this telling, the king of the pit is not a rebel. He is the most obedient angel ever made. Hold that thought gently. It changes the air of the entire chapter. The second corridor leads into a single peculiar line in the older Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. In Proverbs, there is a famous saying that locusts have no king. But in the Greek translation of the prophet Amos, the 7th chapter, the translators rendered a difficult Hebrew phrase in a way no one quite expected. They wrote that one locust was the king, and they named the king Agag, or in some manuscripts, Gog. The same Gog who in Ezekiel leads a vast northern army against the people of God in the last days. The translators, intentionally or accidentally, had braided the locust swarm and the eschatological warlord into a single image. Whether this was a slip of the pen or a glimpse into an older, marginalized strand of belief, the line has remained, gleaming faintly, for anyone careful enough to notice it. The third corridor leads into our own century. There is, on the border of France and Switzerland, a vast scientific facility called CERN, whose great underground ring drives subatomic particles into one another at speeds approaching the speed of light. A portion of that facility sits in a small commune called Saint-Genis-Pouilly. In Roman times, the same patch of ground was called Apolliacum. And there is said to have been, in that older century, a small shrine to Apollo upon that exact ground. Some modern readers find themselves unable to set that detail aside. They look at the great underground ring. They look at the bronze statue of the dancing destroyer that stands in the CERN courtyard. They look at the 9th chapter of Revelation, and they find themselves, in the late hours of certain nights, wondering whether the older world's image of the key turning in the throat of the pit has by some long, quiet pattern recurred. There is no proof. There is only the long human habit of finding old shapes in new places. We come now to the close. Let the lantern grow dim. Everything we walk through tonight has dissolved, in the end, into the great, patient hush of time. The watchers, in their columns of falling fire, are still bound, untroubled by any season we will live to see. The cities of Akkad and Babylon and Uruk and Nineveh are dust beneath dust. The cave above the salt sea is empty. The buried codices have been read, translated, and laid down in modern libraries. The bishops who wrote the canon lists are gone. The emperors who wore the laurel of Apollo are gone. Even the older dread that some cosmic stone might fall and tear open the crust of the world has for tonight passed by. The skies above your roof are quiet. The earth beneath your floor is whole. And you, dear listener, are in your bed. The room around you is warm. The blanket over you is the simplest of all the architectures we have spoken of. Whatever was once kept beneath the world is, for the long sleeping hours ahead, sealed. If even the underworld answered to a calendar, and even the destroyer carried an office and a name, what then could possibly be loose in the small ordinary dark of your own room tonight? The heavy doors of the Apocrypha vault will remain open in the morning. There is no need to come back tonight. There is only the slow, soft hush of the cellar settling, far below the foundations of your house, into a sleep older than yours and gentler than yours. Sleep now, beloved listener, beneath a sky in which every key has been set down for the night.
Sumus Domine Apollo, Ignis Aeternus. By the reckoning of the stars, so it is bound.
Sumus, veni ad nos, Apollo, te expectamus.
The words are sealed, the knowledge waits. We are the watchers at the gate.